Hi, I'm Joanna Drake with Magnify Ventures and co-founder of Raise Global. Today, we're delighted to shine a spotlight on Michael Green from Polar Venture Partners, an early stage venture fund launched just 2 years ago from Polar Asset Management, a Toronto-based multi-strategy alternative asset manager. Mike is a principal at Polar Venture Partners and has led the practice since inception. He has been backing enterprise software, marketplace, and fintech funds, many from the Raise community itself. He's also been an enthusiastic and engaged participant at Raise Summits, and this year we were delighted that he agreed to join our selection committee. So Mike, let's start with a little bit of background. Can you brief us, particularly those viewers in our community who might not be familiar yet with Polar Venture Partners, about the firm, basically the who, what, why, when?
Sure. Yeah, and Joanna, thanks for having me. So Polar Venture Partners, we're an offshoot, as you mentioned, of Polar Asset Management, a Toronto-based multi-strategy asset manager. At Polar, the partners has been investing their personal capital in venture really for the past 10 years. Really, I think is a way to stay close to the community, see what emerging technologies are and sort of different businesses that might later play a role in the public markets. About 2 years ago, through our engagement with managers, we recognized that there was an opportunity to actually invest directly in some of the companies. At Polar, we have, as you can imagine, pretty long history and experience in certain industries, a very good network, and we found that that network could be leveraged working with early stage companies. In particular, as we think about it, helping companies get to what I would consider to be their ideal customer profile in a certain industry. Best case scenario, maybe they get a customer, but in all scenarios, it helps them iterate on their company quicker and their idea. And that's a role that we wanted to play. So with Polar Venture Partners, we put a pool of capital together and essentially, went out to our community and said, when there are interesting seed or Series A opportunities, we'd like to meet the companies, get close with the founders, and then participate with that pool of capital.
And how many emerging fund managers have you backed to date? How many more do you anticipate backing in the next, call it 12 months or so?
Yeah, so since the start of I'd say since the start of this year in 2021, we've done about 7 investments. So particularly active. Today, I would say there's a roster of about 18 managers spread throughout Canada and the United States. We're excited. We've reserved several slots to invest after the Raise conference this year. The selection committee kept me busy going through about, I think it was 45 decks in a pretty short period of time. And we're excited based on what we've seen to add some more managers to that growing cohort.
That's fantastic. We always welcome attending LPs with a checkbook in hand at the summit every year. Mike, I'm always fascinated by individuals' career pathways to becoming a limited partner and would love you to tell us how you came to join Polar Venture Partners originally, and then more recently, how you came to design and launch a fund of funds.
Yeah, well, for me, my journey with Polar started actually in 2015. In addition to fund investments, the partners at Polar have invested directly in private companies. I actually joined in 2015 as an operator to one of those private businesses, a company that's now known actually as InvaFresh. At the time, it was Invatron. I joined that business as chief of staff. The co-CEO of that business was actually a Polar team member that had joined to lead the company. And in the 6 years that I was with the business, we exponentially grew it. We had a great success. The company actually sold fresh item management software to grocery stores globally, specifically helping them figure out the appropriate amount of fresh product to have on the shelves. You can think about an Albertsons, for instance, and the question of, how many rotisserie chickens do I bake in the store? How many loaves of bread? How many cut steaks? Things of that nature. So, really got deep operating experience in that business. And we grew it. I think it was, about $3 million in top line when we joined to just over 40 when we exited in 2019. And one of the things that we realized in that run was having the Polar affiliation really helped the business. When we wanted to go, meet a certain executive, either be of a complementary technology company or a potential partner or even a grocery store, the Polar name helped open a lot of doors for us. And when we exited that business, and we had these, ongoing discussions with our venture partners, we realized that there was something there. In particular, asking ourselves, well, if we take that same operational rigor and that networking experience that, we saw be successful at InvaFresh, can we actually apply this to some of the early stage investments that our partners at other venture funds are making? So, that was the first thought. And the best way to really test the thesis was to go talk to the partners that we'd been investors with for a decade plus, and all of which sort of resoundingly said, yeah, if you can help portfolio companies grow, then absolutely, that sounds like a great fit. So, the next step for us was we did two things. One is we put together a pool of capital for directs, which was essentially funded by partners at Polar and also our GP's balance sheet. So again, all employee internal money. And then also we put together a pool of capital, again, from our management co to invest and double down on that manager strategy. And I think for us, we see it on two fronts. One, we can successfully grow, a venture business inside of Polar, but also the connectivity at a grassroots level to the venture community has proven to be so helpful for us as a business. I mean, as we think about it, we're playing in the IPO market, in the public market, in SPACs is a huge part of our business, and there's been a pretty big convergence with venture over the past few years. So the ability for us to make connections, when we see businesses on our public side, just knowing them and knowing the community on the private has proven to be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Very unique perspective. And I would not have anticipated grocery supply chain software being part of the pathway to an LP seat at the table. But having gone through the entrepreneurial cycles yourself, that must make you that much more of a valued investor and backer working with funds. So that's fantastic. Tell us a little bit more, when you go to meet GPs and think about new fund investments, what are some of your most important criteria to consider when you may or may not back an emerging manager in your portfolio? So tell us a little bit about your perspectives on specialization versus generalist, maybe stage, number of partners, any other critical criteria that help you make your decision.
Yeah, I think in terms of stage, we're quite focused on pre-seed and seed in particular. We want to be getting to know companies at their earliest stage. Number one, I think in terms of the type of manager we're looking for, one of the criteria we always say is we want to know that the manager has experience and has been successful, fishing in the proposed pond, so to speak, that they have connectivity into that network, either as an operator or a venture investor. There's a real reason why founders would want to partner with them in particular. And I say them, being the sole GP or the partners versus the brand of the actual company. Because to us, I think it's always about the individual. In terms of specialization, again, I mean, we're obviously going to be geared more towards areas that we spend a lot of time in, be it enterprise software, marketplaces, fintech, dabble a bit on the consumer side. But, for us in particular, it's also finding managers that we know are passionate about what they're doing, and that also have, skin in the game. They've, in many cases, as we think about it, have left, generally a lucrative or a promising career doing what they were doing, to start in a smaller venture fund, which, as we all know, is can be challenging and quite a big risk. And the rewards of being successful, aren't immediate. It certainly takes a long time to build that up. And our view is, if that individual had an opportunity cost in starting this business, then they're going to care about this a lot, and that we're totally aligned with them in the success of that business. So for us, again, that's hugely important. And then I'd say the last piece is a really good alignment of values and culture. As I mentioned prior, in this call, we have our own initiatives and goals that we'd like to achieve with this business. And we expect that any manager we partner with is going to help us in that. And I think likewise, we want to understand from the manager, what their same initiatives and goals are, and certainly how we can be helpful for them in achieving that. So yeah, again, and that's probably the biggest point, is just is just culturally aligned on the mission that we're both trying to achieve.
And you didn't mention any criteria around geographic focus. Can you speak to geographic specialization?
I think on geographic, I mean, for us, it's, generally more focused on Canada and the US. I think, an area that we're starting to spend more time, and I think like most is, non-coastal VCs, VCs that are spending time in areas that, potentially, are or were overlooked, and finding businesses and founders that, might not necessarily have that attention and hype that you'd see in San Francisco, LA, New York, but fundamentally have great businesses that then and are even at times working a bit harder to get capital and to get noticed. I think those are areas where we're particularly interested. But again, for us in that sense, not as, if it's in Canada and the US, not as concerned about specific geos, but more about the manager and like I said, the types of businesses of which they're investing.
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel about emerging fund managers that don't have a track record on paper yet? And what advice would you give to any that you may be meeting with who can't substantiate a proven track record in their first meeting with you?
Well, I think there's a question of, whether or not that track record is actually there, and whether they're disclosing it or not. I mean, sometimes we do see managers talk a lot about their thesis. There is a track record in the background. It hasn't been presented clearly. For us, I think that's always a challenge because we're going to get there at some point. And I think for me, track record details right out of the gate are so important. And irrespective of exactly what they are, I think a justification for the manager to talk through them, talk through wins and also maybe talk through losses, or deals that, perhaps they could or would have done differently. And is it structure? Is it, the investing strategy? Is it a sector? I think those are all important points. But then there's also times where we come across managers that were former operators that have great ideas, great networks, and don't have that established track record. And I think, we're still open to those discussions, potentially for smaller checks. In particular, with niche strategies, I think it's important if the manager talks through to say, hey, this is an idea that I have. This is why I think it's compelling, and is upfront with the fact that I don't have a track record doing it. And I, I'm trying to build your trust and confidence with you knowing that right out of the gate. So I think a lot of it comes down to approach and then also what the ask is. If it's a $10 million fund, writing supporting checks in a niche space with reputable investors, I think you're going to get a lot more comfortable with maybe lack of a track record than you would if it was a $50 million fund aiming to write lead checks and lead term sheets. So it's all circumstantial.
Let's talk a little bit about process and due diligence. Over the years, as I've interviewed all the LPs coming through Raise, it seems to me that there's usually ends up being somewhere a range of 4 to 8 meetings before an experienced LP will make a decision to back an emerging fund manager newly introduced to their portfolio. Tell us a little bit about your process and what can our community members expect when they engage with you?
Yeah, so I think for us, one of the things is we haven't, I won't say that we've sat down and said, we need to have 4 exact meetings or 6 or 8. But for us, it's really all about spending genuine time with the manager. I would say before an investment's made, absolutely, that sort of 6 to 8 meetings or touch points have happened by that time. But, we don't think about it as in that type of structure. What we always say to managers is we try to establish right away, number one, what we're each trying to achieve. We want to be able to understand their business and we want them to understand ours. And what we always say to them is, let's mutually take that back and, let's find a deal to talk about. Let's have more conversations with some follow-up thoughts that, we've had from this discussion. And Joanna, I mean, this from experience, we recently invested in Magnify, and I think that was, exactly how our conversations went. Very natural, just starting to get to know one another. If we haven't met one of the partners in the GP partnership, we look to spend time with them. We also look to bring in multiple stakeholders from our organization. to meet the GPs and to talk through, our business. And I think once that happens, it becomes evidently clear on both sides that there's an understanding, that there's a trust, and most importantly, there's an excitement and enthusiasm to work together. And until that's established, and sometimes that can be established in shorter times because there's a close reference and network. Other times it takes longer. But those three criteria need to be established before we make an investment.
Makes a lot of sense. And yes, I can give testament to your flexibility and in fact your informality in relationship building. I have so few LPs that just pick up a phone and call me with an idea or a question in the moment these days, and you happen to be one of them. So much appreciate the relationship building outside of very formal settings and boundaries. It's actually extremely productive. What advice would you give to a first-time fund manager pitching you post the summit date? If you come across either via the LP portal or you hear one of the pitches live, would love to hear what you're looking for out of the gate.
I think, for me in particular, what I always like to say is, I think it's so important for the GP to really think long and hard about why they are doing what they are doing and why it's compelling. And for a moment, take a second and put themselves into an LP seat and think, at the end of your interaction with them, whether they see your deck or you have a conversation, you really need to make a solid case of why they'd be crazy not to invest with you. Obviously, it's not always the case. Sometimes there's yes and no's for different reasons, but I think you have to, don't just fit yourself into a box because that's how you feel the deck should go. That's how you think something should be presented. But ask yourself what makes your opportunity so compelling versus not even hundreds anymore, the thousands of other venture investments one can make. And also, I think, sell them on your partnership, of why they want to work with you, and what other value and insight they're going to get out of that investment that perhaps they won't get out of others. I know for us, one of the things why we prefer emerging manager investing in particular is we love the interaction with the GP and the decision maker. That's quite unique, is that you're investing with an awesome GP with great experience, with great insight, and you can maybe I'm one of the only ones that takes advantage, but you can just pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, what do you think of this deal? Or what are you looking at? You guys just made an investment in X company. That's super interesting. I've seen a lot of there's just tons of access and so much you can gain from that if you want to be an engaged LP. And I think GPs should just make sure they're capitalizing on all their strengths as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. So we just completed the selection committee review process, and we're able to call out some trends in terms of specialization, focus, et cetera, across the applicants this year. Curious to hear from your perspective, what are you seeing too much of, and what would you like to see more of?
It's always a tough question. I would say, on the generalist side, I think we're constantly seeing a lot of funds talking about founder relationships. And I think, that is a key component for sure in venture investing, both on the networking side and on the value add piece. But I think it's important for funds to go a layer deeper. It's important to be founder friendly. It's important to have great founder advisors, and it's important to see great deals through a founder network. But I think one of the areas we're not seeing enough of is funds talking about why in a specific industry for a specific company they can be helpful. Mm-hmm. That's an area we'd definitely like to see a lot more of. One of the things that I was interested in particular with Raise was we're seeing a lot of different ways funds are playing, climate issues and generally impact investing. Everything from technologies to, also rethinking, the food, the ecosystem, the food chain. And, that's an area that I think is super interesting and we want to see a lot more of.
Mm-hmm. That's where that grocery retail supply chain background's coming to the fore in terms of your perspective. Mike, we had a really interesting conversation amongst the selection committee members today. about how the quality of the GPs in our pool this year is remarkably high. But one area that was not as strong as they would anticipate and hope for was in demonstrating competitive advantage. Can you share with us your perspective on competitive advantage, and if you have a conceptual example of a fund that you've worked with that has a real edge in that bucket, what might it be?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think when we think about competitive advantage, a lot of times, we can overcomplicate that. What does that mean? And I think it boils down to, frankly, why you win. Why you're winning allocation in a deal, and what are examples you can point to for why you should win that. We have an example of a GP that we've been investors with, for quite a while, and he has a very clear network from two things: one, his alma mater, where he went to school, and also where he used to work. And his thesis is all around being founder friendly, which I've said, can be an issue at times, but I'll go a layer deeper. But, fishing in that pond, finding great companies from, those two arenas, but also taking the time with the founder to be that person on their cap table to really understand the business model. And I've observed in multiple companies that individual dig through with the founder different ways to think about gross margin, how to position their product, to thoughtfully think about different markets and how to actually attack them, and then tie that back to their next capital raise and how they want to think about that. And what we've noticed is we've observed is that you see how helpful that actually is for the founder, because that manager is just spending, frankly, I think more time than some of the other co-investors in certain deals. And that leads to, clearly founders, when they're talking to new startups and their counterparts, saying, this is someone you should bring on your cap table for a pre-seed or seed deal, because they are going to do this. So I think, if you're that individual and you're talking to prospective investors, I think you want to point to, this is what I did for this company, this is how it was helpful, and it led to, either this outcome, but more importantly, it led to this next deal. And I think, examples like that are just so helpful in building conviction around a manager, and frankly, why we would want to invest.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Let's switch gears. I have one more question for you. When you think about your due diligence efforts, how important are co-investors? And I want to take that question into two directions. One is the co-investors that the GPs tend to be collaborating with in their direct investments, but also the co-investors that are joining into the LP syndicate.
Yeah, again, a really good question. I mean, I think starting with, with not the LP syndicate, but co-investors in the actual deals, I think, again, that's super contextual. And we just had that conversation on the selection committee, I guess, an hour ago, which is, it's one thing to talk about co-investors that have invested with you and put, logos on a slide. It's an entirely different thing to signal and show that, in specific deals, shortly after you're getting involved, well-established venture funds are following on. I think if that's actually true, then you need to highlight it. It's important. I think, just as important to suggest if, established fund managers and funds are calling you on deals that might be too early for them or too small. I think those relationships are important, because it shows the thought leadership, that GP has, and it also gives you a sense of their reputation within the community, which I think is also hugely important and something we think a lot about. And, I would say co-investors in the LP syndicate, it's not the first thing we look at unless it's one of the first things that is presented. We definitely, value the co-investors that are there. We have a network, within this community that we collaborate with frequently. And, our view is, and the way we think about it is, if that investor is in this fund, and we've had good success in collaboration with that investor, then it's something we take a deep look at. We've all said this, venture is a team sport. So it's no different on the investor side, I think, than it is on the direct investing in company side.
Terrific. Well, I want to give a little tip to those that are wanting to get to know you, and that is that you will be co-hosting our in-person gathering on October 19th in New York with some of your colleagues. So hope that you have a chance to meet a lot of new emerging fund managers from the raise community you have not yet met, as well as co-investors from an LP perspective. So thank you for co-hosting, and hope that will be a wonderful gathering. And meanwhile, thank you for sitting in the raise spotlight today and for joining us and backing so many great emerging fund managers coming out of the race community. We really value your partnership.
Absolutely. Thanks for the time, Joanna.